Welcome to the Language Arts Gallery. Today, we're going to continue with our academic writing and research course, and we're going to build upon our last lesson where we talked about language for the introduction, and now we're going to talk about language for the methods section. So, I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about what goes in the method section. What parts does our method section or our chapter 3 include? Well, you want to speak to the research design. You want to talk about the participants, what the population of your study is, and how you're sampling that population. Data collection procedures, the instruments that you're using and the procedures that you're following, how the data is going to be analyzed, and what sort of ethical considerations you're adhering to. So all of these things are going into the methods section, but why? What's the purpose of this, right? We talked about our chapter 1, our introduction. We talked about our chapter 2, our literature review. And we talked about that link. That was one of the first things we talked about before we even talked about the introduction. But now our method section. This seems like the most boring, stale element of our research project. Why do we include this? Well, we want to explain how the study was conducted, and we also want to allow the scholars that come after us to replicate our study. Remember that we're filling a gap in the research based on the work of previous scholars. And with our research, there are going to be limitations. And we need to disclose that to our audience. And that creates a gap for them to fill. So perhaps they want to replicate our study with a different population. They can do that because we will have explained exactly what we did in the methods section. We also want to justify our research design and the procedures that we followed. And even though we're really simply telling what we did in our method section, we're also crafting an argument. We're saying why we chose this particular approach and how it's appropriate to help us answer our research questions. So, in our design section, we're going to talk about what type of study we did and why. When we talk about our participants, we need to talk about who, how many, how were they selected? The research instruments, we're talking about the tools and materials used, the procedures, what exactly was done and in what order, how is our data analyzed, and what did we do to protect the rights and the privacy of the participants in our study? So I want to shift focus and talk a little bit about language here. So when we talk about what we did in our method section, we want to use the simple past tense. Data were collected from 3 urban schools. We use the present tense when we're describing documents, established facts, or we're telling what we're doing in this section. And we're going to look at an example of that in a moment. And the present perfect we use when we're referring to previous studies. Now, these are not all hard and fast rules, but this is some sort of indication, some guidelines that you can follow as you're being mindful of your verb tenses when you write your chapter 3. So here, I think this is really useful. We've got some common verbs that you can use to describe your design. We can say employed, used, adopted, utilized, describe the process, followed, conducted, implemented, the tools, utilized, admitted, administered, developed, employed, and to analyze the data, coded, transcribed, interpreted, calculated. So now let's go to key academic phrases. And again, we're talking about stock phrases that we can find in each section of our methods chapter. We talked about this when we went over our introduction. We looked at those stock phrases that you can find, and now we're going to do that same thing for our methods section. Remember, if you're borrowing these phrases and you're applying them to your own writing, to your own research project, that's not plagiarism. We said there is a distinction between interlanguage and plagiarism. If we're talking about the introduction, and if we say, in recent years, there have been a wealth of studies on, that's not plagiarism. These phrases they're commonly found across dozens or hundreds of research articles. People don't own the rights to that language. It's as much yours as it is anyone else's. So let's go ahead and let's look at some examples here. When we talk about our research design, we can say, this study employed a qualitative, a quantitative, a mixed methods research designed to explore whatever topic it is that we're exploring. And then what type of approach did we take? A case study, an experimental, a survey-based approach was selected, an ethnographic approach was selected in order to. The rationale for selecting this design was to ensure, you want to tie this back to your research questions. And I think this is really helpful, some different transition phrases that we can include in line with previous research. Based on our research objectives, a phrase I use very often, given the nature of the research questions. When we're talking about the participants in our study, the participants consisted of a total of 91 individuals were recruited from a large public research university. Participants were selected using a random sample, a purposive sampling technique, a convenient sampling technique. Inclusion criteria, I think that's something that is important to include, our inclusion as well as our exclusion criteria. So, for example, I was researching expatriate teachers in South Korea, and I excluded native Korean teachers because I was interested only in expatriate teachers, people from other countries. I was also interested only in people who are living and teaching in South Korea. So I excluded teachers who are teaching online from abroad. Some transition phrases that we can use, we might say in line with previous research, based on the research objectives, given the nature of the research questions. So you can pause the video, take a moment and think about your research design and the participants in your study. And I want you to use one or perhaps more of these stock phrases, and I want you to apply it to your work. Okay, so now let's proceed to some other sections. We're going to talk about the research instruments. Data were collected. Remember, data were, not data was, data were collected using a survey, interview protocol, observation checklist. The instrument was adapted from. If you're taking an existing research instrument and you're adapting a survey to meet your need. It consisted of 3 sections. It consisted of 45 items. Validity and reliability, you need to speak to that. How is validity ensured? How is reliability established? As outlined below, prior to data collection, that's a great opportunity to talk about how you spoke to any ethical concerns and you received informed consent from your participants. To ensure consistency, you can say to ensure reliability, to ensure validity. When you talk about your procedures, we're going to use a lot of sequence words here because we're talking about procedures or steps in a process. The study was conducted over a period of 3 months, 6 months, 3 years. Data collection followed a series of steps. Remember, we said we're talking about a process beginning with, and that's where you're going to let your audience know this is where we started. Each participant was given blank minutes to complete the task. So you want to be clear. You want to let your audience know exactly what was done and what the time frame for that task was. All interviews were conducted in person, over Zoom, and recorded with permission. Given the nature of the research questions, so you're justifying your procedures, and you can use transitions like the following steps were taken. Again, after obtaining consent. And then as you're transitioning to data analysis, once data collection was complete, now you're transitioning to your analysis. So again, you can pause your video. You can think about how you can apply these stock phrases to your own research project. So now let's talk about data analysis. Once data collection was complete, we proceeded to analyze the data using SPSS software, using NVivo. A thematic, statistical, comparative analysis was performed to identify the relationship between whatever two variables you were exploring. Descriptive statistics, such as what, were calculated. And open coding was used to develop categories and themes. And you can use transitions like for the purpose of analysis, according to the analytical framework, or in interpreting the data. You do want to speak to ethical considerations, of course. Ethical approval was obtained from, you might need to reach out to an organization where you're doing your research. You might talk about your university's institutional review board. All participants provided informed consent prior to data collection. Anonymity and confidentiality were maintained by. You want to speak to the steps that you took to ensure that the participants' anonymity and confidentiality were protected. Participants were informed of their right to withdraw at any time. And you can use transitional phrases like in accordance with ethical guidelines with respect to participant rights and as part of the ethical protocol. So again, you can pause the video and you can apply these stock phrases to your own research. Now, hopefully, you've got a set of really good phrases that describe the different elements of your method section. Of course, you're going to have to expand on those significantly as you write your chapter 3. So let's go ahead and let's take a look here. We've got a very simple method section here with some very vague language. It says, in this study, I used a survey to get info. Some students at my university participated in the research. So we're talking about our research participants there. After the survey, I talked to them and wrote down what they said. So we've got a survey, and that sounds like an interview. So it sounds to me like this researcher is using a mixed methods approach. I looked at the answers and saw some patterns. So it looks like they're analyzing, they're doing some type of thematic analysis and seeing what sort of patterns emerged. I think this was the best method. So why did you choose this method? What did this method ensure? Everyone was okay with doing the study, and I checked the questions before, or I checked the questions to make sure they worked. So you're talking there about informed consent and checking the questions to make sure they worked. You're talking about validity. I checked with people first, then we did the study. So it sounds like any sort of permission or informed consent was received before any data was gathered. So a way we can change this is to say this study employed a mixed methods approach, beginning with a survey to collect quantitative data from undergraduate students at the researcher's institution. Following the survey, semi-structured interviews were conducted to gather additional qualitative insights. So we're talking about how we gathered the quant and the qualitative data. Participants' responses were analyzed thematically to identify emerging patterns. This methodology was selected due to its effectiveness in capturing both broad trends and in-depth perspectives. So we've got those broad trends that are identified from the quantitative analysis and those in-depth perspectives that we're gleaning from those semi-structured interviews. Prior to data collection, ethical approval was obtained and participants provided informed consent. The survey instrument was pilot tested to ensure clarity and reliability of the items. Data collection proceeded in 2 phases, with the survey and followed by interviews. So again, feel free to pull stock phrases out of that answer and see how you can apply that to your own writing. That write-up right there, that might be part of what we would include in an abstract that we're presenting or we're submitting to present at a conference. All right, so now let's go ahead and move to our skills lab, and we're going to talk about proper punctuation for citations. So let's take a look at this. According to Smith, 2020, APA style is important for academic writing. Wow, we've got a lot of errors here. Okay, and they're all related to punctuation. And since we've got a quotation, we're going to need to include a page number. So after we've got a narrative citation here, according to Smith, and we've got the year of publication 2020, comma. Now we've got our citation or our quotation. So we want to say exactly what Smith said, and we're going to put exactly what he said in quotes. And APA, of course, we're capitalizing the acronym for American Psychological Association. But even if we didn't have an acronym, we still want to capitalize what begins that quotation. Then, once we close the quotes, we want to include the page number outside of the quotes, page 15, and then our period. So, place commas after the introductory phrase, periods go after the parenthetical citation, and capitalize what is in quotations. So I want you to create both a parenthetical and a narrative citation based on the following work of Jones. Jones, in his 2024 research, said graduate students often struggle with academic writing. So, if a parenthetical citation would be graduate students often struggle with academic writing, Jones 2024, or a narrative would be Jones 2024 contends that graduate students often struggle with academic writing. Now, this is not cited as a quotation. So this is simply we're citing his work. And if we were citing exactly what he said, then we would put it in quotations. Here we've just got a very simple phrase for the purpose of explaining the punctuation. So we want to remember, we want to put a comma between the author and the year, Jones 2024, when we're using parenthetical citations, and periods go after the citation, academic writing, and then we put the citation and Jones. So just a note on quotation. Short quotes, less than 40 words, go in quotation marks with the citation and a page number. Periods go after the citation, not inside the quotes. And we use commas after our signal phrases, right? After we're introducing what researcher has found this. So let's practice this here. Brown, 2018, explains that learning styles are not supported by research, page 22. Citation helps avoid plagiarism, Jones, 2020. Taylor 2019 suggests that critical thinking is essential, and APA style includes author, date, and page number, Lee 2017, page 30. So let's take a look at this first one. Brown 2018. Okay, so he explains that learning styles are not supported by research. So first of all, I've got this period inside the quotes. It needs to go back here. Okay. And it's got to follow the page number. Citation helps avoid plagiarism, Jones 2020. So I've got a parenthetical citation. Okay. Citation helps avoid plagiarism. Let me correct this here. Okay. I want to make this according to Jones 2020. Citation helps avoid plagiarism. And I'm going to say that is page 6. Okay. And Taylor, 2019, suggests that critical thinking is essential. APA style includes author, date, and page numbers. I've got to include those commas in the list. And then I've got Lee 2017, page 30. So since that is a page number there, I want to include quotations. Okay. So I'm going to fix that there. Okay. So think about what we learned and what we talked about with inner language. Okay. So think about how you can take your introduction and your method section and insert some of these common stock phrases that we talked about to help to make your writing better. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in our next lesson at the Language Arts Gallery.